I'd like to begin with the first question, Nikhil, for you. What do you define as conscious capitalism, if I were to ask you?
Well, I think consciousness and capitalism really do not go together. I
Okay.
think it's very hard to put a definition for that. The wealth disparity in the world today has gotten to such a point that you might want to recoin it as benevolent capitalism in a way. If you go back in time, historically, whenever wealth disparity increased to the point that it has today, in the time of the kings and monarchies, it would be around the time when people went after the king and took away what he had. The world has come close to that point again. So, without sounding too altruistic, I think I would be fair in saying, even for the people who have done well through capitalism, it probably makes sense to be a little bit more conscious for their own good, as much as it is for the ecosystem around them.
Sure. So, just moving on and focusing on another aspect that's been sort of the driving force in the last half decade, ESG. And, it's the big theme word, environment, social, and governance. There's been a lot of pressure on companies to, focus on these ESG goals and cut back on spending on anything that was considered to be bad. But if you just look at the example of one industry, then that's, say, oil and gas. Over the last 5 years, there was no funding for oil and gas companies to discover new oil fields, or investors were asked to shun this industry. And then fast forward to today, where a few months ago there was a crisis in Germany and in Texas because they didn't have enough fuel to power their homes in the winter when there was no sun. And if you look back to as late as now, with the dependence on Russia and no investment in Europe, the world is held at ransom because of this oil and gas. So just wondering, want to get your thoughts on how best incentives can be aligned so that we don't have such a situation in the future. Although the goals are realistic, but how do you align the incentives?
Well, the entire narrative around ESG, I think, was overstated, and it became really cool to invest in ESG funds. Maybe over the last 5 years, uh, traditional sources of energy will remain relevant for a long, long time. I think at least into the next decade. We might have that short term gap which has to be filled in because we relied so much on ESG funds and all the money went in there. But I think the world will naturally correct very quickly. I don't think that's going to be an issue. The problem with ESG is not just investing in a ESG fund, but how you kind of segregate and rate the different products available out there. Like if you were to take India as an example, ITC, for example, ranks really highly on the ESG scale. It's in the top five, but it's a company which makes 80% of the money that it does from selling cigarettes. So it's hard to determine what is actually ESG compliant. The current scale is definitely not a good benchmark. I think it needs to be reworked totally.
So, so as you can see, we're doing a sort of an interesting parallel channel where Deep is representing another view of capitalism, and I want to counter it by saying that, while like rightly said, consciousness and capitalism may not go along, but I believe that, the fundamental purpose of companies should be to solve a problem, and of course, you make a collateral revenue out of it. But we are moving towards an age where the age of valuations, as I call it, where the focus largely therefore becomes the Excel sheet growth, even if it means at the cost of the customer. Without taking a few names, there are edtech companies today that are heavily, perhaps there's an edtech company whose valuation is greater than India's education budget. And that is kind of worrisome. So how do you really draw the line between profit and no negative impact?
Yeah, there is a age-old principle. We used to call it donut economics. People have spoken about this repetitively in our history. Beyond a point, you have to wonder why growth. We're all ingrained with the notion that growing at a certain pace is good, and we compete with each other about how much growth is good. If you look at Scandinavian countries, if you look at many niche geographies across the world, people have figured this out there. I think mindless growth might not be the norm in the future.
Yeah.
To some extent, you have to understand that growth comes at the cost of burning more carbon or taking more away from the environment than other people
Yeah.
might. And I think we will move to that point where uh, growth will be good,
Yeah.
but growth not at the cost of the damage that
Sure.
growth is causing today.
Yeah, but then, just as a follow up question, how do you? So there's an entrepreneur and there's an investor and there's the customer. Often the entrepreneur is pulled between the goals of the investor and the expectations of the customer. Just as one yourself, and I think in your case, if I read correctly, you haven't really raised capital. It's all organic growth. But there are so many, who don't have that ability. How do they draw the balance? How do those entrepreneurs draw the balance?
I think it's easier for somebody like us because we are not pressured by investors in the traditional sense. But for somebody who has 100 investors to answer to, and if you have too many people sitting on your cap table, it becomes much harder because these people are there to turn a profit. So I guess you have to be mindful of who you take money from as much as how much money you take. Because if you think in a different manner and they think in a different manner, it will eventually come to bite.
So, on the point of chasing growth for valuations, but if you look at the PE and VC space, they also, serve a purpose. And today, some of the biggest problems that the world faces, like, say, hunger, climate change, I mean, these are problems that have to be solved at scale. So, don't you think that, these funds can still serve their purpose while sort of balancing growth and, in your own interest, you have Rain Matter, where you're trying to solve certain problems, some of the world's biggest problems. So, how do you think, we can go about solving these problems at scale and sort of balancing both the objectives of sort of, solving the problem and balancing growth?
See, in theory, I could give you a dozen explanations. Pragmatically, it's very hard. Capital typically chases growth. People who are in charge of capital are also only looking at growth. If I have to be a bit more candid about it, I would say something drastic has to happen in our environment, which kind of like rebalances focus in people's mind, and only then will that change happen. Up until then, I would presume people will chase mindless growth.
Right, so, I mean, just as a follow up, are you doing anything differently, at Rain Matter, where you kind of sort of, prioritize purpose over growth or valuation?
So we split Rain Matter into two entities. One is looking for growth. The other entity is more working towards making the ecosystem better. So we have projects around reforestation. We are trying to get access to satellite companies which measure how much carbon credits are being created. Trying to fix the water table. So we fund projects like that, but that's a separate wing from the wing which tries to make a profit.
As a final question to myself, do you think an idea like having a social enterprise stock exchange, as they're talking about, where there's an exchange where specifically you can buy equity stocks into companies that are creating impact, or another parallel mechanism called impact bonds? Do you see a future of that in a complex country like India, where it's very hard to measure and codify impact? Because you can measure profit, but impact is not something that's very easily measurable.
Yeah, I think the world will move in that direction. I think we're still too early, but maybe not in the next 2, 3 years, but in the next 10 years. Not just because companies feel the incentive to do it, but I think at a certain level, government might end up mandating them to do it. So people will invest more towards impact when that happens. But the early movers are there today, and they are kind of like moving in that direction.
What do you define as impact? Just as a philosophical question.
Well, we've done a lot of projects around education, around sanitation, around many different causes. Uh, it's very easy to curve fit, look at data in a manner. If you want to look at the data in a manner like you want to reinforce the fact that you've changed something. But at the scale that India sits at and how big our economy and our country is, it's very hard for any one single entity to create impact. Barely ever happens. To me, impact is if I felt like I attempted to make a change, I think that is impact enough for me.